Hey there, welcome to the channel. My name's Greg. Today I'm going to show you how I made this mortadella stick. I'm using a recipe in this book, The Art of Making Fermented Sausages by Stanley and Adam Mariansky. Let's look at the recipe. Mortadella is made from pork only, pork and beef, or pork fat and veal. If back fat is diced into quarter-inch pieces and whole pistachio nuts are added, the resulting product will have traditional look. Mortadella is not smoked. The meat this recipe calls for is 55% pork butt, 25% beef chuck, and 20% back fat or hard fat trimmings. That's a very high fat content sausage. Pork butt's usually going to be 25 to 30% fat. Beef chuck is usually going to be 25 to 30% fat. And it also calls for back fat or hard fat trimmings. Probably going to be delicious. So this mortadella recipe is pork and beef. Calls for pork butt. Actually what I have here is picnic ham, which might be a little more lean than the pork butt. I think that'll be okay. It's still pretty fatty for a ham, picnic ham. And it calls for chuck, beef chuck, and I have beef trim. And I think my beef trim is definitely at least as fatty as a beef chuck would be. So anyway, just going to cut this into pieces that'll fit in my grinder. And these are going to get ground together, so I don't need to keep them separate anymore. I've got my weights. I'm going to put this back into the freezer so it can firm up a little bit before I grind it. This recipe calls for salt at 3%, which I find to be a bit more than I like. 2.5% is plenty for a dried sausage, so I'm sticking to 2.5%. It's going to use cure number 2, which is interesting because it's actually a cooked sausage. But that's what it's calling for. I guess it does take more than a month to dry all the way because of the size casing. I guess time will tell. We'll find out. This particular mortadella recipe is going to be fermented and cured. It's going to take a while. It's going to use a cure number 2. This is a very different mortadella recipe than all the others I've seen, or I think that I've eaten. Because to me, mortadella it's usually like an emulsified sausage, like a very fancy, delicious bologna. But this one is interesting. It's different than any of the other ones I've seen, which is why I'm giving it a try. It's got dextrose because it also has a starter culture. This one uses TSPX. The starter culture ferments at room temperature. It's a slower, more mild acidification. I'm going to add a 1/4 teaspoon of the culture. To that, I'm going to add a 1/4 cup of clean, fresh water. Now I have well water, but if you live where there's like a municipal water system that uses chlorine to treat it, probably a better bet to use some distilled water to make sure you got clean, fresh water. So I'm going to set this aside, keep getting things going. Done with this, I like to tape up my opening. I store it in one of these bags. It's almost like a hybrid Ziploc vacuum seal bag. It's reusable. It's got the zip top, and it also has this for your vacuum sealer. If your vacuum sealer has one of these attachments, if not, you can buy them for like 20 bucks. They're not too bad. It'll just suck the air out of this. It's a reusable bag that you can vacuum seal. Find that's the best way to store these, and then I just keep them in my freezer. As well as dextrose, it uses sugar. Uses ground white pepper, some garlic, some rum, and some pistachio nuts. Going to need some dextrose to feed the starter culture. As the starter culture eats the sugars, it produces lactic acid. That's what lowers the pH. This recipe also calls for sugar. All the percentages are relative to the protein, relative to the meat and fat combined. This recipe calls for ground white pepper. This recipe calls for garlic. I'm using granulated garlic. Doesn't really specify, but at 0.1%, fresh garlic's not going to bring a lot of garlic flavor to the party. I know that. And I know that the mortadella should have some garlic flavor. That's my dry spices. This recipe calls for rum. And I've also got a few pistachio nuts. Step 1. Cut back fat into 1/4-inch cubes and set aside. Easy enough. My recipe tells me to cut up the fat into small cubes. It says 1/4-inch cubes. I forgot to put a towel under this. All right, now it won't slide around on me. That's better. As I was saying, it's going to be a pretty fatty sausage. It's 20% fat. It's cut up into cubes. Then it also calls for pork butt, which is a fairly fatty piece. And then it calls for chuck roast, beef chuck, which is also a fairly fatty piece. Okay, I'm going to put this back into the freezer. Step 2. Grind pork through the 3/8 or 10 millimeter plate. Refreeze and grind again through the 1/8 or 3 millimeter plate. Do the same with the beef. I don't see why I can't just do them both at the same time. And I will have to settle with the 4.5 millimeter plate because that's the smallest one I have. Looks like I forgot to turn my camera on. Gosh, darn it. Well, this is double ground. This is my pork and beef for the mortadella. I ground it through the 10 millimeter and then through the 4.5 millimeter. That's what it's looking like. It's still very cold. It's still 29 degrees because I had it really cold when I started. Try not to forget that again. It's hard to make a video if you don't turn on the camera. Step 3. Mix all ingredients with meat and diced fat. Not going to forget the camera this time. Make sure it's below 35. We're still down at like 30 degrees. Plenty cold for the mixing. Got my liners on under my gloves so my hands don't freeze and so that this can stay as cold as it can. So I'm going to start by just mixing in my starter culture. Just start to get that spread around a little. And then I'm going to add in my salt and start mixing that in a little bit. Squeeze, I knead, flip it around, just trying to get all the little individual pieces from the nice grind into a homogeneous mass. Going to add the rest of the ingredients here. Going to add those cubes of fat. They've been chilling in the freezer for the last little bit. Seems like a lot of fat. It's going to be kind of awesome. I'm going to throw in these pistachios. I went 50% more than it called for because it didn't look like very much to me. So I'm just going to give this a little mix, try to mix those things in a little bit evenly. So I'm going in with the rum. That's the last ingredient. That's the liquid component. Hopefully that's enough liquid to bring it together. I'm not sure. Doesn't seem like much liquid. Super interesting because this seems more like a salami as far as the texture that they want. But it's going to be cooked, but like not all the way, and then it's going to be dried. Sounded interesting to me. The Marinsky's seem to know what they're talking about. Consider them a resource. If the recipe's in their book, probably okay. Sticking to my hand like I would want for a sausage or, a salami. Kind of looking at this as a fine textured salami that's partially cooked. We'll see. Pretty excited to find out. I think that's good. We're lifting the bowl. Sticking to my hand. Guess it's time to put this sucker into a casing. Stuff firmly into 100 to 120 millimeter, 4 to 5 inch protein-lined fibrous casings. Well, the recipe in the Marinsky's book for mortadella calls for 4.5 to 5 inch protein-lined clear casings. I'll be using 3 inch because it's the biggest ones I have. I have some bologna casings, but I'm really not sure if that's the right material. These are going to be dried, fermented and dried, and I'm just not sure that's going to be the right material. So I will be using these. And I'm just going to put them in a bowl, and I'm going to cover them with some warm water. And I actually like to open it up, make sure to get some water on the inside, and just make sure that they're completely submerged. And I'll set that aside for about a half hour or so while I get some other things together. It's a pretty stiff batter, but it is sticking to my hands. You can see it's got our strands, it's a little strandy. You can see it. If you look, little strands coming off of it. Just trying to squeeze the air out each time I put some in. Looking pretty good. I got most of the air bubbles out. All right. You know, we gotta always move up this horn. Felt extra dry today. That feels extra big too. Got the big horn on because I got a big casing. Big 3-inch casing here. Just going to try to get this back as tight as I can. Got this stuffed all the way. Now I'm just going to twist this up as tight as I can and then twist a couple more. Now, I bought these ones pre-tied. Last few videos, you know, I made a mistake. I ordered some ones that weren't pre-tied, which is silly because they cost the same pre-tied or not pre-tied. And you might as well just have to tie the one knot rather than both of them. That's my opinion on it. But what I'm going to do, make that flap there, and I'm going to tie another knot right here over that flap. And that should be good, but actually I like to go back over to the other side. Call it my insurance knot, you know. If you're not sure if your knot, tie a lot. And then I could hang it from here, but I think I will hang it from the other side, but still just going to tie these together in case I want to hang it from this side. And either way, I'll put the tag on this side if I don't put the I don't hang it from here. All right, got my sterilized prickers. This step's just going to help it dry more evenly. Don't worry, the grease won't leak out. What happens is these holes end up getting filled by the meat itself. I think we're good. I'm liking this. Step 5. Ferment at 68 degrees, 20 degrees Celsius for 72 hours. 85 to 90% humidity. So I did pull as much as I could out of here. But what happened was there was a piece of fat on the bottom of my hopper. So the plunger would only go down so much. I had a much bigger layer at the bottom than I usually would. So I have kind of a big test piece. Just going to wrap that up in some saran wrap here. And even though this recipe just says to give it 3 days, I want to see what pH it gets down to. So if I want to repeat this, or if I feel like it's too tangy, I could do it to a lesser degree. You know, I'm a curious type. Switch this over to my bigger pan so it'll fit straight. And I got a couple more salamis I'm going to put on here. But once I get my other salamis on here, actually here, I'll do the one side right now anyway. Cover my tray with plastic to keep the humidity high. Seems like, you know, 90% humidity plus or minus. So, you know, 85 to 95%. Probably 100% would be fine. I'm going to put this other piece on after I do my other salamis because I got a couple more to put on this tray. But you get the idea. All right. Be back in 3 days. I'm smelling it already. 5-1, 5-1-2. It's only 58 degrees. It's like 10 degrees cooler than it should be. We're in the safe zone. We're below 5-2. So I'm going to weigh it here, see where we're at. I'm going to start cooking it off. Step 6. Preheat smokehouse with no smoke applied to 120 degrees, 49 degrees Celsius. And hold sausages at this temperature for 12 hours to remove the moisture from the sausage. Gradually increase temperature until an internal temperature of 138 degrees is obtained. Well, I'm going to use my oven. And I'm going to use a thermometer in my oven to monitor the temperatures. And I'll just turn it off. I'll turn it off and on. So as it gets up towards 120 degrees, I will turn it off. Let it cool down a little. And I'll monitor it that way. Because I don't have an electric smokehouse. I was borrowing one for a little while. But I don't have a smokehouse that makes heat without making smoke. And since it says in the beginning, mortadella is not smoked, I'm going to stick to that and just make this work in my oven. I have a probe in my oven down to about, temperature's falling right now, down to about 108. So I turned my oven back on. Temperature stopped falling and it started to rise. Now that the temperature's starting to rise, I'm going to turn the oven back off. And now the temperature will keep rising for a little bit. So you can see the temperature is peaked out all the way up here. I literally had it on for about a minute and a half, and it'll take quite a while to start dropping. So yeah, had it on for about a minute and a half, kept rising for another 8.5 minutes. And now it's just gonna hold itself. It's gonna very slowly go down. So this is cooking it, between 110 and 137 for quite a while. It's a little bit of babysitting, but it's getting the job done. It's been about another 35 minutes, so I'm going to turn my oven on for a minute again. It's like every 45 minutes, it needs to be on for about a minute. It's a little bit of babysitting, but like I said, it is getting the job done. Step 7. Cool sausages by hanging them at room temperature. Well, that's an easy step. Well, the book said to hang this at room temperature to cool down after it heated up to 138 internal. So that's what I did. So now the next day, I'm going to put this into my drying chamber. Step 8. Dry at 54 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 to 16 degrees Celsius, at 80 to 85% humidity. Well, that's perfect. My drying chamber runs at 55 degrees Fahrenheit on the average, and roughly 80% humidity. So that'll be just great for this. Well, I've got my mortadella hanging in here. Has to hang in here until it's lost 30 to 35% of its weight. I did toss it on the scale before I put it in here. It's lost about 13% of its original weight now. So, in the cabinet for a while. Sausage is dried until around 30 to 35% in weight is lost. Now, mine lost more than that because between the ice storm we just had with 8 days of no power, I didn't really deal with any of this stuff. Cycled my generator between my freezers, my fridge, my charcuterie cabinet, but I didn't have water, so my hygiene wasn't the greatest, and I didn't want to actually mess with any of this stuff. And just right before that, I was out of town for a family emergency, and so some of this stuff stayed in there longer than maybe I wanted it to. But since this mortadella seems more like a salami than like a bologna, I don't mind it being closer to 40%. That's kind of where I like my salamis to be. Well, this has been in here a little bit longer than I wanted it to be. But such is life sometimes. Let's go check it out. Time to give the mortadella a try. After the cooking process, this had lost about 13% of its weight. After about 30 days in my drying chamber, it had lost 35% of the weight. The recipe calls for 30 to 35% weight loss. I kind of was treating it like a salami. I like my salamis closer to 40%. Mortadella I'm used to is more of an emulsified sausage, but this recipe was definitely more like a salami. So this has been in my drying chamber for about 7 weeks now, and it is about 40% weight loss. Definitely a little drier than the recipe called for, but let's see what it's like inside. All right, I'm liking that. I'm liking the look of the cube fat. Let's give it a slice. Try another slice. That first one, I mostly just tasted the pistachio, even though I couldn't see any pistachio. Kind of caught me off guard there. Okay, I'm seeing a tiny little piece of pistachio right up in the corner here. So let's try a taste away from that. I like the big fat chunks. You can see that little bit of pistachio. Casing's bound really well. You know, the meat matrix is pretty tight, looking good. Okay, my thoughts on this. I've got a few thoughts. I like the taste. I like the pistachio. I really like the big fat hunks in the middle. However, I think this is one of those salamis. It's not really a salami. It's partially cooked. It's partially dried. It's kind of like a summer sausage or a Thuringia, which I kept calling a Thuringia in my video, but it's Thuringia, except that it's not smoked, but it's partially cooked and it's dried. And I think this would be better at 30 to 35% weight loss than it is at this 40% weight loss like I typically like my salamis. I think with this size casing, which is smaller than the recipe calls for, if I were to pull it at 30 to 35%, it would have been less than a month. It should use cure number 1, not the cure number 2 the recipe calls for. That said, the recipe calls for using a much bigger casing, and I think I could see it taking more than 30 days to get to that 30 to 35% with the bigger casing. This has been in 7 weeks and it's at 40% weight loss, but it was at 35% weight loss after 30 days in the cabinet. So it was probably at 30% well before 30 days. The nitrate in cure number 2 needs to convert to nitrite before it can be bound as nitric oxide, which is when it becomes safe to eat. That's the curing process, is the nitrite converting to nitric oxide. If I were to make this again, I would use the bigger casings that it calls for, and I would pull it between 30 and 35%. That said, the next mortadella I make, I'm going to attempt to make an emulsified sausage. I mean, it tastes like a mortadella, but it doesn't have the texture I'm used to as a mortadella. It doesn't really have the flavor I'm used to as a salami. Look at that pistachio hanging out in the corner there. I mean, it's a pretty looking sausage. It's a pretty tasty sausage. I wouldn't make it exactly like this. Like I said, I would use a bigger casing, pull it at 30 to 35%. But I think my next mortadella is going to be an emulsified mortadella. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you like this kind of content, make sure you're subscribed to my channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Whatever you do, put some love into the food you're making. Peace.